Javier sat on the sofa with his phone resting loosely in his hand. The screen lit. He kissed me just now. Javier leaned back slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting. He typed, "I knew it. I need details." Gail's phone vibrated softly on the table beside him. He picked it up. Javier's message waited on the screen. Gael smiled to himself. The warmth of the kiss still lingered in his chest, settling there in a way he hadn't expected. Outside, the plaza lights were still glowing far below the hill. Tomorrow morning, the square would wake again. This is Men Being Too Intimate Season 3. The Orange Avalanche. The plaza held its early morning shape. Shutters were halfway open along the cafes. Gael dragged metal chairs across stone near the terrace. The fountain ran in a low, steady rhythm. Javier slid a crate of oranges onto the edge of the stand. The wood caught briefly against the metal leg before settling. He adjusted the tablecloth with one hand while holding his phone to his ear with the other. Rafael answered on the other end. Javier shifted his weight and reached for the crate again. At the same moment, a wheel brushed the corner of the stand. The contact was light. The crate tilted. Several oranges rolled free and moved outward across the stone. Javier caught the crate before it fell completely. The phone slipped from his shoulder into his hand. One orange struck lightly against the metal frame of a wheelchair. Gael steadied himself without assistance. He leaned forward with practiced control and stopped another orange with his palm before it rolled farther. Javier ended the call. Gael passed the orange back toward the stand. Javier crouched and collected the remaining fruit. When he stood, he took Gael in properly for the first time. The chair sat balanced beneath him with quiet precision. His hands rested easily on the rims, forearms strong from repetition. Javier's gaze met Gael's. "I'll make you a juice," Javier said after a moment. "You feel responsible?" "No, I was sorry if it caused you trouble." A brief silence settled between them. Gael nodded once. Javier placed an orange into the press and lowered the handle with measured pressure. The machine hummed under his grip. Juice gathered in the cup below. When he set it on the counter, Gael's hands rested lightly on the rims of his wheels. He took the cup and shifted slightly to clear space. Javier adjusted the crate beneath the counter and aligned it carefully so it sat flat against the wood. The plaza began to fill. Gael remained near the side of the stand. He positioned himself so the flow of people moved around him without interruption. His chair aligned naturally with the seam in the stone, angled just enough to avoid the corner of the table. Javier wiped the counter and glanced toward him. "Is it difficult?" he asked, allowing the question to settle before finishing it. Gael held his gaze for a moment before answering. "You mean through people?" "It depends on how they move," he said. Javier nodded and placed another orange into the press. Gael shifted his hands lightly along the rims of his wheels, the movement familiar and unforced. Javier watched the ease with which he adjusted his position. The chair responded immediately to the smallest change in pressure. Gael finished the last of the juice and placed the empty cup on the counter. The plaza remained within its first hour. Two women stopped near the stand and studied the chalkboard without speaking. One tilted her head toward the cafe at the corner. The other hesitated, still reading the handwritten list. Javier noticed them but did not move toward them. He finished wiping the press, folded the cloth once, and set it aside. He waited. Gael observed the same exchange from the side of the stand. The women shifted half a step away, their decision not yet settled. Gael rolled forward just enough to enter their line of sight. "You will miss it," he said. They turned toward him. "The best orange juice in this town," he continued, his tone even. The women glanced toward Javier. Javier met their eyes without gesture or invitation. His hand rested lightly against the press. The women exchanged a few quiet words between them and stepped forward. "Two, please." Javier nodded and selected the fruit with care, testing the weight in his palm before placing each orange into the machine. Javier wiped his hands and looked at Gael. "You're good," he said. Gael shifted slightly in his chair. His hands settled again on the rims before he turned, aligning the chair with the open path toward the fountain. Javier watched the movement. Gael paused once more. "You press them yourself every weekend?" "Yes." Gael rolled away toward the fountain without further comment. Javier remained where he was for a moment longer, then reached for another orange and placed it into the press. The sound of the motor blended back into the rhythm of the morning. Javier worked through the last of the prepared fruit, lowering the press with the same steady pressure he used every day. Rafael approached from the cafe terrace and stepped behind the stand beside his husband, setting down a stack of cups before sliding a crate farther beneath the counter. Near the fountain, movement slowed. Gael had angled his chair slightly away from the stand. His hands rested on the rims without turning them. His shoulders aligned toward the open stretch of plaza near the East Street. Javier followed the direction of Gael's attention. "That's Andrés, right?" he asked to Rafael without shifting his gaze. Rafael glanced toward the fountain. "Yup." He reached up and straightened Javier's collar, then pressed a brief kiss to his cheek before returning to the crate beneath the counter. The first chord carried across the square with a clarity that did not compete with the fountain. Gael had heard the arrangement many times before. Andrés played in the plaza regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes beside the older musician who kept a steady rhythm beside him. The songs were familiar enough that Gael could anticipate the rise of the chorus before it arrived. He positioned himself near the front of the small crowd without hurry. The stones sloped slightly near the fountain, and he adjusted once to settle evenly. People filled in behind him. Gael watched the shape of the sound rather than the movement of the square, the lift of Andrés' chin at the higher notes, the small breath drawn before the transition into the second refrain, the way his fingers pressed more firmly against the neck of the guitar when the rhythm deepened. He did not look elsewhere. When the song ended, applause moved through the gathered crowd in a gradual swell. Gael's hands came together with the others, steady and unembarrassed. Andrés looked toward the front row, and their eyes met without delay. The acknowledgement held for a second longer than courtesy required before Andrés lowered his gaze and adjusted the guitar for the next song. Across the plaza, Javier finished folding the last length of canvas from the stand. He tied it down and stepped back to check the alignment of the crates. The music continued. He glanced toward the fountain. Gael stood out to him immediately. His chair faced forward. His shoulders leaned slightly into the sound. His attention did not wander when others shifted or crossed between him and the musicians. Javier lifted one of the empty bins and set it into place. "How close are you with Andrés?" he asked Rafael, keeping his tone even. "We drink sometimes," Rafael said. "That's all." Javier nodded once. Rafael studied him briefly. "What is it?" Javier adjusted the strap around the crate. "Nothing." He looked toward the fountain again. The following morning unfolded with the same order as the one before it. Javier had already arranged the oranges in 2 neat rows and secured the edge of the canopy where the fabric had loosened overnight. Rafael stood beside him, counting the coins and placing them carefully into the tin beneath the counter. Gael approached at a steady pace and stopped directly in front of the counter. "1," he said. Javier looked up immediately. Juice gathered in the cup below. Rafael leaned forward to wipe a small streak of pulp from the counter near Javier's hand. His shoulder brushed lightly against Javier's arm before he stepped back into position. Gael placed the coins on the table. As Gael lifted the cup, Javier reached for another orange. He pressed it in the same measured rhythm and placed the second cup beside the first. Gael's hand stopped. "I didn't order that." Javier wiped his hands on the cloth and shifted his chin slightly toward the fountain. "You should give one to him." Gael followed the line of his eyes. "Is it that obvious?" Javier met his gaze steadily. "I watched the square." Rafael shifted his weight and looked between them. "What square are we watching now?" Javier stepped closer and nudged him lightly with his hip, pushing him half a step to the side of the counter. "Go stack the cups." Rafael laughed under his breath and moved, brushing his hand briefly along Javier's lower back as he passed. Gael held the look between them, then turned his chair toward the fountain. Rafael watched him move away. "You are invested," he said quietly. Javier adjusted the crate beneath the counter so it sat flush against the leg of the stand. "I am observant," he replied. The musicians had already begun tuning near the fountain by the time Gael reached the edge of the crowd. Andrés stood slightly apart from the older guitarist, adjusting the strap across his shoulder and checking the pitch with small deliberate turns of the tuning pegs. Gael approached. He stopped just outside the first row of listeners and held the juice in his hand for a moment before extending it forward. Andrés looked at the juice first, then at Gael. "Thank you," Andrés said. Their fingers made contact briefly when the weight shifted from one hand to the other. Neither withdrew quickly. Gael remained there as the first chord carried across the square. The music rose gradually, measured and clean. The crowd thickened behind him. When the song reached its second refrain, Andrés glanced forward. His eyes found Gael. The look held only long enough to register recognition before returning to the rhythm. Across the plaza, Javier stacked the last of the empty crates beneath the stand. Rafael wiped down the counter with slow, circular movements, though his attention had shifted. Javier glanced toward the fountain once. Then again. Rafael noticed. "Javi, are you checking Andrés?" Javier let out a short breath that almost passed for a laugh. He turned his head toward Rafael and held his gaze for a second, steady and amused. "I'm checking the exchange," he said. Rafael leaned his elbow against the counter. "What exchange?" Javier's gaze remained on the front row of the crowd where Gael stood steady and attentive. Rafael followed the line of his sight. He watched Andrés lower his head toward the microphone between verses and saw the juice cup resting at his feet. Rafael looked back at Javier. Javier allowed himself a small smile. The music carried across the square as the song ended and the applause rose. Near the fountain, Andrés leaned slightly toward Gael and said something that required Gael to bend closer to be heard. Javier observed the angle of the conversation, then turned back to the stand. The next weekend returned with the same arrangement of light across the square. Gael arrived within the same hour as before. The timing was no longer accidental. Javier had already arranged the oranges and secured the canopy when he saw him approaching. Rafael stepped aside as Gael stopped at the counter, the movement natural now. Their exchange remained simple. Coins rested briefly on the wood before changing hands. Andrés played as he always did beside the fountain. Once, as he shifted his guitar strap, his hand settled briefly on Gael's shoulder before moving away again. When Gael returned to the stand later that morning, he did not approach as casually. "He touched me," he said. Javier set down the cloth in his hand and studied him. The following weekend brought the same rhythm. Gael arrived again. "I don't think he notices me," Gael said. Javier regarded him without hurry. "You have nothing to worry about," he replied. He pressed his palm lightly against his own stomach in quiet demonstration. "You are in better shape than I ever was." Gael looked at him for a second before the tension broke. He let out a short laugh. Javier's mouth curved in response. Rafael glanced between them, shaking his head as he returned to the stack of cups. Across these weekends, Gael also began to see what had always been present between Javier and Rafael. The way Javier leaned into him when the line thinned. The ease of their closeness, unperformed and steady. Then one weekend morning, Gael approached the stand. The song rising from the fountain did not belong to Andrés. Gael's hand tightened slightly on the rim of his wheel and pushed back from the counter. The chair turned cleanly toward the open stretch of stone. "Gael!" Javier called after him. Gael did not slow. He rolled toward the edge of the square, the unfamiliar voice carrying behind him as the music continued. Javier remained still for a moment, one hand resting flat against the counter. He adjusted the stack of cups so they aligned evenly, then looked toward Rafael. "Message him," Javier said. "Message who?" "Andrés." Rafael frowned slightly. "What am I checking?" "Why he's not here." Rafael glanced toward the fountain as if only now noticing the absence. Rafael took out his phone and leaned against the counter while typing. The response came quickly. "He says he caught a cold past few days, stayed home. He's feeling better now." Javier absorbed the information without visible reaction. "Ask him if he's free tonight." Rafael looked up. "For what?" "Just ask." Rafael returned to the screen and typed again. A moment passed. "He says yes, why?" Javier held out his hand. "Give me your phone." Rafael hesitated only briefly before handing over the phone. When Andrés answered, Javier's voice was even. "It's Javier from the plaza. We're setting up dinner tonight near the fountain. You should come and eat properly." There was a pause long enough for Rafael to glance toward him. "Yes," Javier continued. "Tonight." When the call ended, he returned the phone without explanation and looked again toward the direction Gael had taken. He dialed. The first call went unanswered. He let it ring to completion before lowering the phone and sending a message instead. "Dinner tonight at the plaza. The reply came within minutes. Not in the mood. He pressed call again. This time Gael answered. Dinner, Javier said. Tonight. You don't have to stay long, Javier continued. Just come. Javier ended the call and set the phone down face down on the counter. Rafael studied him with open curiosity. I'm hosting. The unfamiliar song reached its final line. Night settled over the plaza without the noise of the market. The fountain ran steady, catching the reflection of string lights that stretched between the cafe terrace and the old stone arch. The square held a slower rhythm now. Javier arrived with Rafael as the evening settled fully over the square. The table had been reserved outside near the fountain. It was set for 4, though only 3 chairs stood around it. Andrés arrived next. He greeted Rafael with a brief clasp at the shoulder, nodded to Javier, and took one of the chairs without hesitation. Gael arrived last. The light from the cafe caught along the metal frame of his chair as he crossed the square. He slowed when he reached the table, taking in the arrangement. Javier shifted his own seat slightly to widen the space. Gael positioned himself along the open edge and settled into place. For a moment the 4 of them sat within the same circle. Javier spoke first. Something ordinary about the heat lingering from the afternoon. Rafael added a story about a customer who had argued over fruit quality earlier that week. Andrés laughed. Gael listened. Gradually the conversation reorganized itself. Rafael leaned back slightly in his chair and observed the way Andrés angled his body toward Gael. Small plates began to arrive one after another. Andrés lifted one and hesitated briefly before placing it onto Gael's plate. The gesture was simple. Gael glanced down at it, then back at him. Thank you. For a while, conversation softened into the rhythm of passing and tasting. Forks crossed briefly over the same dish. Fingers brushed near the bowl of olives before retreating. Javier allowed himself a small smile and lifted his glass. The night was no longer about introduction. It was about alignment. The plates thinned one by one. The square had grown darker, voices around them settling into evening softness. A server approached. Bills were settled without discussion. Chairs shifted lightly against stone as they stood. They moved away from the brighter edge of the square and into the side street that climbed gradually toward the older buildings. The fountain sound faded behind them and was replaced by distant conversation and the hum of traffic beyond the ridge. The incline became noticeable halfway up the street. Gael adjusted his grip on the rim. Andrés watched the change. Let me, he said. Gael hesitated only long enough to acknowledge the offer. Then he lifted his hands from the wheels and rested them lightly against his thighs. Andrés stepped behind the chair and placed his hands on the handles. The first push required more force than expected. The slope held firm. Andrés leaned forward into it, breath shortening as he adjusted his footing. Rafael continued walking beside Javier, steady and unbothered by the grade. Javier felt the pull in his own legs and said nothing. Halfway up, Andrés exhaled sharply. It's steeper than it looks. It always is, Gael replied. There was no strain in his voice. They reached the flatter stretch near a small tree set into the stone. Andrés released the handles and stepped forward again, brushing a hand once across his forehead. Gael turned slightly toward him. He reached up and lightly straightened the strand of hair that had fallen across Andrés' forehead. Thank you, Andrés said. Javier caught Rafael's sleeve and drew him back half a pace. Give them a minute, he murmured. Rafael glanced toward the pair ahead. He understood. They stopped beneath the tree while Andrés and Gael continued a few steps farther before pausing again. Andrés leaned closer now, speaking in a lower voice. Gael listened without breaking eye contact. Behind them, Rafael nudged Javier lightly with his shoulder. You planned this, he said. Javier did not deny it. He watched Gael's expression change. As Andrés stepped slightly aside to speak again, Javier lifted his hand where only Gael could see it and gave a small, unmistakable thumbs up. Gael's mouth curved, just briefly. The night carried on around them. After a moment, Andrés gestured farther up the street. My place isn't far, he said. I could play you something. Gael looked toward the slope ahead. This time, he said, I push myself. Gael rolled his sleeves once and set his hands firmly on the rims. He pushed. The first rotation was controlled. The second carried more force. His shoulders engaged, arms steady, breath measured. The chair moved upward without hesitation. Andrés walked beside him, close enough to step in if needed. He watched the movement carefully. Impressed. Halfway up, Gael increased his pace slightly. "You might be good with fingers," he said, breath even, "but I'm good with my arms." Andrés looked at him fully then. "I can see that." Behind them, Rafael slipped his hand into Javier's. They began their own descent toward home. The night was warm enough to linger. Andrés let his fingers rest against the strings before lowering the guitar carefully to the floor beside his chair. Gael held Andrés' gaze as the last vibration faded. Andrés stood and stepped toward him. The kiss held long enough to register before they drew apart. A phone vibrated against the table. Gael glanced down at the screen. "How is it going?" Gael let out a small breath through his nose. "I'll use the bathroom," Andrés said after a moment, nodding toward the hallway. "Back in a minute." Gael nodded. The bathroom door closed softly. Gael did not type immediately. He replayed the moment once in his mind before letting his thumbs move. "He kissed me just now." The reply came quickly. "I knew it. I need details." He typed again. "We talk tomorrow. And thanks for tonight." There was a pause before the next message appeared. "Over orange juice, you're welcome." Gael looked at the screen for a few seconds longer before placing the phone back on the table. The bathroom door opened. Outside, the street was quiet. An ESFJ builds connection through attention. A presence that notices what others miss when the world moves too quickly. For Javier, the plaza is never random. He remembers faces. He watches how people move through the square. An ESFP moves through the world differently. Energy first. A restless pull toward whatever feeling rises brightest in the moment. For Gael, life has always been motion. Following music, turning wherever the day feels most alive. In the plaza that morning, neither of them forced what followed. Javier noticed. Gael trusted, an ESFJ and an ESFP. Different ways of moving through the same square. But sometimes connection begins somewhere unexpected. Sometimes it begins with an orange juice across a small wooden stand, and a friend who was already watching the moment arrive. This is Men Being Too Intimate, Season 3. The Orange Avalanche. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more stories on gay audiobooks. Also my short novel, Men Being Too Intimate series, The Unplanned Weekend. The Night We Found What We Lost, The Rules of the Dance, and more are now available on Kindle Unlimited. You'll find the link in the description. Hope you check it out and enjoy. Thank you.